After the naval battles of Port Arthur and Chimalpo in early February 1904, Japan officially shocked the world. While all of Russia was still reeling from the surprise attacks, countries like Britain and the United States had to admit Japan was bold, dangerously bold. And so the Russo-Japanese War broke out. At that time, Japan had already placed Port Arthur under a full blockade. But the war didn't end as quickly as they hoped. They were facing what was then considered the strongest fortress in the Far East. Meanwhile, Russian morale had sunk to Mariana Trench levels, not just because of the surprise attack, but due to a string of defeats both on land and at sea. To salvage the situation, the Tsar dispatched Admiral Stepan Makarov, one of Russia's most brilliant naval commanders, to the Far East. And the moment he stepped foot on the battlefield, it was like a jolt of electricity through the Russian fleet. There was hope, a real chance to turn the tide. But Admiral Togo of Japan had no intention of letting Russia rewrite the script. On March 10th, the Japanese sent 4 destroyers to approach Port Arthur, seemingly taunting the Russians. The Russians took the bait and sent out 6 ships to chase them down. But as soon as they left the harbor, other Japanese ships quietly laid down mines along their exit route. Result: 2 Russian destroyers exploded. Japan had taken clear initiative. Of course, Makarov wasn't just some amateur. In retaliation, he launched a counterattack that damaged 2 Japanese cruisers, Fuji and Yashima. Fuji suffered heavy damage. Japan was suddenly sweating. But then tragedy struck. On April 13th, Makarov's flagship, the Petropavlovsk, hit a mine and sank so quickly that almost no one had time to react. The brilliant admiral died with his ship. The loss was such a blow that even Admiral Togo, his enemy, ordered the entire Japanese fleet to fly their flags at half-mast in mourning. A warrior honoring a fellow warrior. With Makarov gone, Russia once again fell into disarray. The blockade on Port Arthur held strong, and every attempt to break free failed. The Japanese didn't come away unscathed either. They continued to lose ships to Russian minefields. Even after death, Makarov made his enemies pay. On August 10, 1904, Russia made one last desperate attempt to break the blockade. The Pacific Fleet tried to reach Vladivostok, but was intercepted by the Japanese Navy. They were forced to retreat empty-handed. No ships were lost, but another key commander, Admiral Vitgeft, was killed on the bridge of his flagship, Cesarevich. The pressure was mounting fast. Tsar Nicholas had to gamble big. He ordered the entire Baltic Fleet, stationed way over in Europe, to sail halfway around the world to reinforce the Far East. This was no small fleet. 45 warships, including 12 battleships, 8 cruisers, dozens of destroyers, supply ships, and more, all under Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky. But life isn't a fairy tale. Since Britain supported Japan, the Russian fleet couldn't pass through the Suez Canal and had to sail all the way around Africa. The detour was brutal, taking months longer than expected. Russian sailors, unused to tropical heat, were exhausted. The journey was so long that if you compared it to Hanoi traffic, it'd be like commuting from Chualang to Hoguam during rush hour, every day for 8 months straight. Finally, on May 20th, after a grueling journey, the fleet reached the waters near Shanghai. But in a cruel twist of fate, Port Arthur, the port they were sent to save, had already fallen back on January 2nd. Now the only option was to change course and try to sneak through the Tsushima Strait to reach Vladivostok. The problem? That entire area was under Japanese control. And thus began the lead-up to one of the largest naval battles of the 20th century. On the night of May 26th to 27th, 1905, the Russian fleet entered the Tsushima Strait. The
The sky was pitch black, the sea rough, fog thick, and their wireless communication went dead silent to maintain secrecy. They were hoping, just maybe, they could slip through unnoticed and reach Vladivostok under the cover of darkness.
But of course, life is never that simple. The Japanese weren't careless. They had spies stationed in Shanghai, and patrol ships were constantly scanning the Tsushima Strait day and night. At 2:45 a.m., the Japanese cruiser Shinano Maru spotted a Russian hospital ship, the Oriole. Now, instead of raising the alarm, Oriole mistakenly assumed the Japanese vessel was friendly and literally signaled, "Lots of us nearby, come hang out." It was one of those tragic self-sabotage moments you just can't believe. Shinano Maru quickly followed the signal and discovered 10 more Russian ships hiding in the fog. At 4:55 a.m., Captain Narukawa reported back to Japanese headquarters. Enemy fleet located at Grid 203. When Admiral Togo received the message, it was like striking gold. At 1:40 p.m., the two navies finally came face to face. One of the greatest naval battles of the modern era was about to begin. Togo raised the Z flag, a symbol of no retreat. "The fate of the empire rests on this battle. All hands, do your utmost." That declaration rang out across the waves, a vow to fight to the bitter end. The battle lines. Japan fielded 4 battleships, 27 cruisers, 21 destroyers, 37 gunboats, and a swarm of torpedo boats. Togo's flagship, Mikasa, was armed with 4 12-inch (305mm) guns and 14 6-inch (152mm) guns. Though the Russians had bigger ships, Japan held all the cards: initiative, superior speed, more modern weaponry, and a better navigation system. Meanwhile, the Russian fleet, exhausted from an 8-month tropical journey, was in bad shape. The ships were outdated, the crews were fatigued. Togo sensed blood. He lined up Mikasa, Shikishima, Fuji, and Asahi at the front and unleashed his signature tactic, crossing the T, but in his own style. The Japanese fleet performed dazzling zigzags, sudden turns, even full 180-degree pivots to confuse the Russians and gain ideal firing angles. And then hell broke loose. The barrage began. The Japanese opened fire, not a few rounds, but 2,000 shells per minute. The Russian ships vanished under a rain of steel. The Borodino took a direct hit from Fuji to its ammunition magazine and exploded in a massive fireball. Admiral Rozhevsky was struck in the head by shrapnel and lost command. Rear Admiral Nebogatov had to step in amid the chaos. Within hours, 4 Russian battleships, Suvorov, Oslabya, Alexander III, and Borodino, were sent to the ocean floor. By evening, Japanese destroyers and torpedo boats swarmed the survivors from every direction. The Russian fleet tried to retreat north, but it was hopeless. They lost 2 more battleships and 2 cruisers. Meanwhile, Japan had only lost 3 torpedo boats. The disparity was staggering. The final collapse. Nebogatov and 6 remaining ships were completely surrounded. Realizing the end was near, he ordered a surrender. But not everyone obeyed. Some Russian captains chose to fight to the death, and they now rest on the seafloor, honored even by their enemies. Only 3 Russian ships managed to reach Vladivostok: the cruiser Almas and 2 destroyers, Grozny and Bravi. The rest? 21 ships sunk, 7 captured, 4,380 killed, 5,917 captured. In contrast, Japan lost just 117 men, 3 torpedo boats, and had 583 wounded. It was a devastating one-sided victory. Aftermath. So what happened to the 2 Russian commanders?
Nebogatov and Rozhjevsky were taken prisoner, later returned to Russia. They weren't executed, but their reputations were destroyed. Both served time in prison before being pardoned, but to the Russian public, they were seen as failures. After the Battle of Tsushima, Russia had no choice but to negotiate peace. They signed the Treaty of Portsmouth on December 5, 1905, recognizing Korea as a Japanese protectorate, withdrawing from Manchuria and ceding the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan. 5 years later, in 1910, Japan officially annexed Korea, facing little resistance from the international community. A turning point in history. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a major European power. News of Japan's victory spread across Asia. Beijing, Saigon, Delhi, millions of people of color celebrated. The Japanese had erased the shame Western powers had imposed for centuries. The Battle of Tsushima shattered the West's belief in white superiority, a widespread ideology at the time. Japan, a country that had only begun modernizing 50 years earlier, had risen to become a top-tier naval power. But victory came with consequences. Japan grew overconfident. The military elite gained political control. The government shifted toward militarism over diplomacy. This trajectory eventually led Japan down the path of extremism and finally, World War II. Russia, meanwhile, plunged into crisis. Defeated at sea and humiliated before the world, the Russian Empire began to crumble. Just months later, the Revolution of 1905 broke out, shaking the Tsar's throne to its core. A sea that swallowed an empire. One battle, one turning point.